The far-reaching, the boundless future will be the era of American greatness. In its magnificent domain of space and time, the nation of many nations is destined to manifest to mankind the excellence of divine principles. John O'Sullivan.
It's always been and will always be a predominant theme of the American people's psyche to seek out new horizons and reach as far as their will and determination can take them, and then to reach out a little further. The nation, as a whole, and right down to the very individual, has forever sought out what new frontier lies just over that next hill, or what is waiting to be discovered just beyond our sightlines. We came west, across an ocean, to make a new home where we could live our lives free from religious persecution, and then we pushed further till we were met with the Appalachian Mountains. With the purchase of the Louisiana territory from the French, our nation doubled in size overnight, and with the return of a small band of explorers called the Corps of Discovery, the hearts of the American people were slowly set aflame with the possibilities that this vast new tract of land offered to them and to the nation. We have always moved west, forever on towards the setting sun. The early settlers' spirits had been imbued with a certain wanderlust since the very moment they set foot on the natives' land. Americans have not always treaded softly or respectfully toward those who came before them, and their relationship with the land has been one containing both reverence and the desire to tame it at almost any cost. Those two simple words, the West, have come to symbolize progress itself. Americans have packed up their lives and set off into the wilderness for a multitude of reasons. They've left their homes for the promise of greater freedom and adventure, for a chance at hope, rebirth, and love, and even for gold. In the beginnings of the 19th century, the United States of America is still a young country, just a generation removed from the fire, loss, and triumph of the Revolutionary War against the British. This bright young nation finds itself in a position to gain new territories through a land purchase from France. In December of 1803, France transfers its authority over the Louisiana territory, which more than doubles the size of the United States overnight. President Thomas Jefferson purchased the 828,000 square miles of land west of the mighty Mississippi for less than a mere 5 cents an acre. A bargain for such rich and fertile yet unexplored lands. The territory stretches from New Orleans all the way up into Canada and west to the Rocky Mountains. This historic deal sparks a heated debate within the U.S. as to the constitutionality of the purchase, a political move which even Jefferson questions within himself. But in the end, he rationalizes the purchase as such.
It is the case of a guardian investing the money of his ward in purchasing an important adjacent territory, and saying to him when of age, "I did this for your own good." Thomas Jefferson.
6 months after the Louisiana purchase is completed, a group of explorers who would soon come to be known as the Corps of Discovery will leave Missouri on a mission from Thomas Jefferson to obtain as much knowledge as they can about this newly acquired tract of land. President Jefferson wants to establish a United States presence in the newly acquired territory before Britain and other European powers can attempt to lay their own claim to it. The secondary motives for the group's expedition are scientific and economic in nature. The small band of explorers are in search of a northwest water passage. If discovered, this passage could open up many trading opportunities with Eastern Europe and keep the growing nation moving ever westward. President Jefferson recruits Meriwether Lewis, who is serving as the president's personal secretary, to lead the expedition. Lewis gladly accepts the mission and receives much training by some of the greatest minds in the country in such practices as medicine, botany, zoology, and navigation by celestial observations.
On the acquisition of Louisiana in the year 1803, the attention of the government of the United States was early directed towards exploring and improving the new territory. Meriwether Lewis.
Lewis writes to his friend, a former Army colleague, William Clark, and he invites him to join the expedition as co-captain. Clark responds to Lewis's request.
This is an undertaking fraught with many difficulties, but my friend, I do assure you that no man lives with whom I would prefer to undertake such a trip. William Clark.
With the combined talents of these men, the wheels are set in motion for what becomes quite possibly the greatest peaceful exploration expedition in American history. The Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, along with 31 others, succeed in their mission, which takes them over 2 years to complete. They succeed insomuch as the party does reach the Pacific Ocean, and in doing so, they create that much coveted presence for the United States in these newly acquired lands. Along their journey, the Corps of Discovery creates over 120 maps of the area crossed, and returns with catalogs of hundreds of botanical, insect, and animal specimens, which are new to American science. The band of explorers do not, however, find a clear-cut water passage to the Pacific Ocean. The elusive Northwest Passage did not exist. The group encounters many native tribes and peoples with whom they establish good trade relationships and an overall sense of goodwill. Thomas Jefferson's desire to establish the much sought-after U.S. sovereignty over dozens of native tribes along the way is accomplished. Before the group's departure, President Jefferson gives the group peace medals, which have his image on them, in addition to a message of friendship. These were given to perceived tribal leaders as a show of good faith and nonviolence.
The first white men of your people who came to our country were named Lewis and Clark. They brought many things which our people had never seen. They talked straight, and our people gave them a great feast as proof that their hearts were friendly. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce.
Along their journey, Lewis and Clark meet a young Shoshone woman named Sacagawea and her French-Canadian husband, Toussaint Charbonneau. The two accompany Lewis and Clark on their mission, and soon after joining the group, Sacagawea gives birth to her son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Sacagawea proves to be a valuable asset to the Corps of Discovery by affirming to the native peoples that the group was one of peace. It would have been unheard of to have a woman in a war party, let alone one with a small child, and this settled the minds of many whom the group encountered.
A woman with a party of men is a token of peace. William Clark.
President Jefferson sees the mission as a success, and the information it provides is a seed that is planted deep in the subconsciousness of the American people. America has set its sights west, and the Corps of Discovery are among the first of many who will see the grandeur and promise that the newly acquired and untamed lands have to offer. As the trade with Europe continues across the Atlantic, American merchant ships bound for France begin facing consistent assaults from the British Navy. Because of Great Britain's ongoing war with Napoleon's France, these American ships become entangled in British blockades. In addition to these blockades, American vessels are enduring the effects of a practice called impressment. American ships are continually being boarded by British sailors. These sailors say that they are looking for deserters from the British Navy, but But all too often, they are taking off with and imprisoning these men, many of whom are not deserters, but in fact are American citizens. This, along with the British restrictions on U.S. trade with France, brings the tensions in our nation to a breaking point. On June 1st, 1812, President James Madison asks Congress for a declaration of war. He is the first president to make such a request. President Madison knows full well the risks that come with this bold declaration, but he also realizes the danger his nation faces if he does not take action against those who show aggression. Though this declaration is unpopular with many in New England because of the adverse economic effects that a war with the British would have on the region, President Madison still gets his war. He sees the issue of impressment as just the beginning of what could become a second attempt by the British to conquer the people of America and keep them under their rule.
Perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. James Madison.
The War of 1812 carries on for 32 months, causing over 20,000 American and British casualties combined, though the war eventually ends in a stalemate with the Treaty of Ghent, signed December 24, 1814. Many of Great Britain's motives for the war quickly dissolve once they defeat Napoleon's army, and there is no longer a need to restrict the U.S. trade with France. The war is seen by some as a second war for independence, and it brings about an era of good feeling in the nation on the whole. It emboldens the young nation's sense of sovereignty and boosts the esteem of the nation.
The war has renewed and reinstated the national feelings and character which the Revolution had given and which were daily lessened. The people are more American. They feel and act more as a nation, and I hope the permanency of the Union is thereby better secured. Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin.
One particular battle also bears the fruit of what would one day become our national anthem. Francis Scott Key pens the lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner while being held captive on a British ship as it attacks Fort McHenry in Baltimore. When he awakes in the morning, he's inspired by the sight of the American flag's broad stripes and bright stars still waving high above the fort after a night of intense bombardment by British warships. The great expanses of what would one day become the western United States were filled with countless creatures whose pelts would fetch more than a fair price by those living back east and across the Atlantic. As is so often the case, money is the catalyst and the fuel which blazes new trails into the unknown and entices men to take risks they might not have otherwise taken. John Jacob Astor is one of those men. From humble beginnings in his music shop in New York City, which he started with his wife Sarah Todd and her modest $300 dowry, he eventually becomes one of the richest men in America. His Pacific Fur Company affects the course of history with its bold movements westward. Fort Astoria, in what would later become Oregon, is a prime example of the Americans' innate belief in manifest destiny and the country's ever-present desire to reach out farther, take possession, and tame their surroundings. Robert Stewart, a partner of John Astor, is stationed in Fort Astoria. Stewart leaves the confines of the fort, bound east for St. Louis. His journey leads him along the Columbia River and then the Snake River in a southeasterly direction. Stewart meticulously maps the details of his journey and collects a wealth of knowledge about the environment around him, much in the same way Lewis and Clark did 10 years earlier with the Corps of Discovery. Without realizing the gravity of what his journey will come to mean, Stewart has completed, in reverse direction, the path that would soon become known as the Oregon Trail. He presents his meticulously kept journal of the trip to Astor and President James Madison, and it is published in France, but it is years before the path is widely used by the masses. Slowly, the word of the untamed lands and all the promise they held would leak out to the general population back east, and these weather-worn mountain men would soon give way to families, farmers, and those seeking new hope in new lands.
How long the trail, how far the goal. Last year the moons might come and go, like dancing shadows on the snow. My heart was light, my heart was strong. I cared not though the way be long. A Song of the Oregon Trail by Helen Hay Whitney.
Roughly 2,200 miles long, the Oregon Trail is the iconic path that hundreds of thousands of Americans would traverse on their journey westward into the fertile valleys of Oregon. Just mention of the trail elicits to this day pastoral images of covered wagons driven by teams of oxen crossing the great American plains. The fur trappers and traders that cut the path from 1811 to 1840 would now yield to wagon trains of farmers, bankers, businessmen, and miners, many of whom would bring along their families for this great American migration. Since the Lewis and Clark expedition, the temperature of the nation's Oregon fever had been slowly rising, thanks to propaganda from those brave few who had made the trip already. To travel westward along the Oregon Trail is a journey born from independent minds and hearts, and the trip begins fittingly enough in a small Missouri town by the name of Independence. Independence, up until now, had been the farthest point westward along the Mississippi River where a steamboat could safely travel. It becomes the jumping-off point for many who choose to undertake the long journey ahead. 1841 sees the first small group of pioneers, numbering no more than 70 persons, strike out from Independence along the Oregon Trail. Their goals were to set out and reach the lush agricultural regions and farm the land. By 1843, the number balloons to over 1,000. It becomes known as the Great Migration, and word begins to spread. The pilgrimage west would take the travelers roughly 4 months, which was 8 months shorter than the quickest route by sea, thus making the land journey a much more appealing option to the average citizen who wished to change their current situation. Each spring, pioneers flood into the town of Independence, Missouri. During their sojourn, they seek out friends and family and make any last-minute purchases of necessary gear and supplies that they will need to take with them for their trip ahead. This influx of temporary citizens does not go unnoticed by the merchants and shopkeepers of Independence. With every spring, there's a boom in business. That businessmen and shopkeepers capitalize on the demands of those who are westward bound is a theme that runs throughout the American expansion. There will always be those who seek out an adventure, and there will always be those there to supply them with the tools that they require along the way. Those westward-bound pioneers who set out from Independence, Missouri, too early, soon would discover that not enough grass had grown along the plains to feed their oxen and other livestock. Those who leave too late in the season face the harsh winters and the closing of mountain passes further west along the trail. Their timing would have to be just right in order to make the journey with the best weather possible. Even with a departure timed perfectly, travelers still faced tremendously violent summer storms that would batter their wagons, which were covered with nothing more than linseed-oiled cotton cloth. During such storms, fatal lightning strikes were not uncommon, and overloaded covered wagons could be pelted with hail the size of cannon shot. All who traveled the Oregon Trail would bear witness to the hazards that Mother Nature set before them, and those hazards which they themselves often needlessly created while on their journey. Many of the travelers fear attacks from native Indians. While this threat is in fact present, the pioneers were much more likely to fall victim to the elements of nature or their own ineptitude. Accidental gunshots, broken limbs, and disease were common occurrences along the trail. The Oregon Trail would continue to be used by those who were westward bound until 1884, when the Union Pacific Railroad Company laid tracks along the route.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.